Well, let's move on to this representation idea. I know you've talked about the Senate in particular, about how it, over time and in the future, it'll be even more uh, unrepresentative of the population than it is now. But it requires an amendment to change that. Maybe we can focus on the House instead. You've talked about changing the number of House members of reps. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
more about what you think there structurally that might create a better institution?
So I'm an advocate of enlarging the House. Um, I think the rule that I would, and let's keep in mind that effectively the House size was frozen after the 1910 census when it reached 435. It wasn't changed in the 1920 census, and a law was passed. It's only a law that froze the House membership at 435. If you look back at why that was done, it was basically because you had this wave of immigrants who came in after the turn of the century, mostly in New York and the Northeast. And then you had a movement of Blacks from the South towards the North. And the powers that be in the House feared what would happen if they were given more representation and there'd be many more seats. So the reason for freezing the size of the House was not a sort of clean, independent, oh, we can't operate effectively as a body with larger numbers. It was political power, basically. But, the House originally was set to have a ceiling of 30,000 for each representative so that the representatives would be closer to the people. Now we have seats of more than 1 million. And at the same time, while the average is now between 700,000 and 800,000, and there is some variation, of course, with each state having at least one representative. But we're also seeing many more districts that are homogeneous in nature, and that accentuates the division between the parties. The competition is basically in primaries, but it also means that representatives don't represent the wider range of people in the society with some level of diversity. So if you enlarge the House, you're at least going to reduce to some degree the disparities that exist out there. You're going to have members who are a little bit closer to the numbers of people that they represent. And if you do this appropriately, you also have a very positive effect on the electoral college, which is growing more and more distorted. The ratio of population between the smallest and largest states is now 70-1. And that means that voters in Wyoming have multiple times the power in selecting a president of voters in California or Florida, say. So if you added the numbers, you would reduce that ratio to some degree. But what I'd like to do is enlarge the House by saying that House sizes will be built around the smallest district in the country. Should be around 550,000. It's Wyoming or North Dakota. And that means at this point, you probably had 150 or 160 seats. You could physically handle that, I think. But what I also want to do is repeal a 1967 law that required single member districts. I'd like to move to allowing multi-member districts and add ranked choice voting. And just to give you an idea of why, in Illinois, for many decades, their legislature was selected in 3-member districts, and people who voted in those districts had 3 votes. You could cast 3 for one, or 2 for one and 1 for another, or 1 for each of 3. And you had a wide range of candidates. You had heterogeneous districts, but the incentives in campaigning were to reach out to different groups of people so that even if they didn't vote for you as their first choice, maybe they give you one of their 3 votes. And so you had a much more moderate legislature, and a legislature that was much more attentive to representing the wider groups of people. They did away with that in the 60s, And now the legislature in Illinois is just like most of the others in the country, divided along tribal lines and with more extreme members. So those are reforms that I think if we could manage them, that don't require constitutional amendments, these are all involving laws, that could actually have a huge impact, positive impact on representation and ideally on deliberation.
Well, maybe that can lead us to our, I know we have limited time, so I'm going to move on to our common questions we ask all the guests. And the first one is really about what you think congressional representation should mean. I mean, obviously, you could only represent the partisans in your district, or you could represent the whole district. You know, what is your perspective on what a representative what it should mean for those congressmen and senators?
So, of course, we have the dilemma here that goes back to Edmund Burke, whether you have your own points of view that govern how you operate, or you are simply a reflection of the voters in your district. If it's the latter, then, and we've seen more of that, and because, as we talked about earlier, the primaries have become the most important part of most of these elections, you end up with a deeply divided country as people represent the extremes more than they do the country as a whole. I think we have a larger problem, which is the House is supposed to be closest to the people. That means it reflects larger national trends. And if something happens, people want to make a change every 2 years, they've got that opportunity. Most of the districts are safe for one party or the other, so it no longer represents the national interest or those larger national trends. And some of that has to do with the nature of redistricting and partisan gerrymandering. Some of it has to do with natural residential patterns. I'll just give you one example, though. Bob Livingston was a conservative Republican congressman from New Orleans for a long time, almost became Speaker of the House, but didn't and left. And I remember at one point, Bob Livingston telling me that in his district, they had maybe 20% African Americans, and they didn't vote for him, and they weren't going to make or break him, basically. But what he said to me was, you know, one, I have a fiduciary responsibility to represent everybody in my district. And two, I don't want to do something that so pisses them off that they will turn out in droves against me. So, for example, he was very sensitive to the idea of a national holiday for Martin Luther King. That district now has a trace element of African Americans. And the representatives who have succeeded him have a completely different point of view. So if you move away from having some heterogeneity, where you hope that somebody getting elected believes that at least to some degree they have to listen to and try to represent the interests of everybody in their districts. And if you basically drain them of the ability to have some competitiveness, where you have to worry about how the other side thinks about you, you end up with some of the problems that we have now. So I think we've moved very much away from an ideal of what we would want with representation, balancing your own partisan interests, your own ideological viewpoints, a larger national interest that might conflict with the interest of your own district or state, or the viewpoints of your own interest or state, with the understanding that you're there to represent both your people and the country's national interest as well. And, you know, I don't think that's something that most members think about for a nanosecond now.
But for yourself, it sounds like you're a Burkean.
More of that than anything else. You know, at the same time, you know, you look at, go back and look at issues like the period right before we entered World War II. Sam Rayburn, the speaker, understood that we would need to extend the draft, the selective service system. It was unpopular in the country. He had to pull out every stop to get a very narrow victory. You look at the civil rights bills in the 1960s, pivotal in passing those civil rights bills were conservative Republicans like Bill McCulloch of Ohio, like Everett Dirksen in the Senate of Illinois, They saw a larger national interest, even at the time, knowing that it conflicted with their own party's political interest. They put first. We have much less of that now, and that's going to be a long-term, enormous problem for us.
All right. So the next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? And that by that I mean between district and DC and legislation versus oversight.
Yeah, I am a long-time proponent of dramatically changing the congressional schedule. I want to have 3 weeks in Washington every month and 1 week off. I want to have those 3 weeks, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. If you're there all week, you're going to have some time to read, to deliberate. You are actually going to have more time to debate on the floor. You're going to have more thoughtful hearings. Now, I would, in an ideal world, I would combine that with a ban for those 15 days a month in Washington, no fundraising. Now what happens, of course, is when members are there, they're spending half their time running off the Capitol complex to either the Capitol Hill Club or the National Democratic Club or to safe houses to do call time, fundraising. You'll have 15 days a month to do that otherwise, but if you're there 9 to 5, you're in the office and you're on the floor and you can do more debate. And I've tried that over and over. We've had speakers. I remember John Boehner, when he first came in, telling me, I'm going to change this schedule. And he hasn't been able to. And no leader has been able to change the schedule in a fundamental way. Members want to go back home. Now, the other plus for this, it would seem to me, is if you're there 5 days a week, 3 weeks a month, you're going to have more of an incentive to bring your families to Washington. And that's not a panacea. We all talk about, many people talk about how, oh, in the old days, they would socialize together, and that would, reduce the level of hostility, of tribal tension. That's true, but it was because of a broader norm surrounding the institution. Senators, many of them do have their families here. They do interact socially, and you can't argue that that's made it a wonderful place for the parties to interact.
Well, that's a good segue into the next question, which is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress? Should it be in committee? Should it be on the floor? Should it be in private rooms? Should it be out in public? What are your thoughts on that subject?
Well, one, all of the above. But I will tell you, I have also been a longtime proponent, written about it a lot, and pushed the parties and leaders a lot to do a series of weekly primetime debates, structured debates on the big issues facing the country. And they don't all have to be divided along party lines. At one point, after a lot of effort, I got the House to do an experiment on this, on the floor, in prime time. But they did it like an Oxford-style debate, except that, of course, they wanted to make sure that nobody was left out. So every subcommittee chair and ranking member participated. So you had like 10 people on each side, and that meant that they would have like a minute to do a proposal, and then a 30-second rejoinder, and then a rebuttal and a re-rebuttal, and it was completely fragmented and didn't at all do what one would want. I really believe that now, if you did this, that it's not that you would get a primetime audience that would rival the old days shows like Friends or Seinfeld, but you would have them up on YouTube, and they would be used in the classroom, and they would be a kind of fulcrum for news shows, the News Hour on PBS, or the shows on cable television, to bring in the people doing the debates or to use excerpts to talk about these subjects. And it would make the public at least see the nuances of some of these issues, the different sides, and it might make Congress function a little bit better, but it also might create a little bit greater sense of legitimacy out in the public. And it still baffles me as to why they haven't seized on this because it's such a low cost thing to do.
And what about the structure of the dialogue itself? You know, I'm a long time a student of scientific dialogue. And in science, you know, there's a common goal, which in theory, which is to arrive at a truth, right? This is the hope of the
Yeah.
scientist, even if they don't always execute it well. But in politics, it's a very different environment where the goal, information is oftentimes just a means to a certain some end. And so misinformation or information can be equally used in order to achieve an objective. And so that creates a problem in dialogue where people don't necessarily use facts in the same way. Any thoughts about how that kind of dialogue could be structured so it would be a more positive experience for everyone? You know, can you agree on a set of facts and use that as a basis for discussion, or any thoughts along those lines?
Well, you know, let me be blunt here. We have one party that's conducted a war on science and facts because the facts are inconvenient for them. And that's the Republican Party now. And so, you know, I've talked, for example, to my friend Bob Inglis, who served for 12 years in Congress, free market conservative Republican, who believes that climate change is real and believes that we need to find market solutions for this existential problem. He is shunned in his own party. He, of course, got dumped in a primary because he was an apostate on this front. And if you think about how you're going to have a debate on climate change, where the debate ought to focus around whether it's appropriate to have a regulatory regime that, you know, prices carbon, or that you have a carbon tax, or you have other kinds of incentives. But you start with a reality that this is a real problem and we have to look for different ways of solutions. But if you have a party that largely believes it's a hoax and tries to undermine the scientists and the data, how are you going to have a dialogue? Think about the way vaccines have been handled now, where data is discarded or challenged. So we've got a real problem on that front. Now, one way that I've thought about dealing with this is setting up, using former members of Congress, a kind of dialogue where you could find people that range across the spectrum ideologically, from progressive left to conservative right, but who accept that there is a problem, accept data and facts, and they're skilled enough at how to deal with a legislative dialogue. And you set up, in effect, you know, a kind of parallel Congress that shows by example what could be done. Maybe that would have an impact or make a difference. But, you know, so much of what we see now, because of the tribal environment, is a reaction that if you're for it, I have to be against it, because if I'm for it, that's giving aid and comfort to you. And even where, I mean, I look at the way Republicans in Congress have handled the vaccination issue by and large, and it's, I'm going to leave my own constituents vulnerable. Many are going to die, but I will own Biden and the left by not accepting this nonsense about vaccination. And it leaves me despairing about the possibility of having reasonable debate on a whole range of issues. Now, that's not every issue. We're seeing it in a positive way on criminal justice reform. We've seen it to some degree, we'll see how it works out, on something like infrastructure. I've seen it on mental health policy, an area I'm deeply engaged in. So it's not everything, but on so many big and crucial issues, it's very, very difficult to have a reasonable dialogue when you look at the viewpoint of the members. That's more true in the House than it is in the Senate, but it's true in both bodies. And now I finally say on this front, you know, if we look at debate in Congress in the past, and you think about the great debates, what's always used as a model is the debate over the entrance into the first Iraq war. George H.W. Bush was president. It was, decision where our viewpoint at that point was we could have a massive war with large numbers of casualties. And we had this 3-day night and day debate in the House and Senate, and everybody thought it was just wonderful. People were speaking from the heart. They saw this as, an issue where you had to put aside a lot of the differences, and you had people on both sides of the aisle arguing both sides of whether the United States should enter the war. But if you go back and look at it, it's not a real debate. It's a series of serial speeches by members laying out their own position. So the Senate has never been a great deliberative body where you have actual debates, where you have a person saying, here's what I believe, and then somebody else gives a rebuttal. And you need to have a different structure to do that. And that's what we need to do. Where we do see that in Congress is sometimes when you have in the Senate organized colloquies, members who come in and structure it around having a dialogue. And dialogue is just not anything that happens with frequency in Congress.
So you don't have a magic bullet for that?
The magic bullet is getting a different group of people.
That's always the hope, is better people lead to a better result.
Now, let me say that if you go back to what we might view as a golden era, Congress had its large share of people of subnormal intelligence, of limited ethics, not necessarily everybody you would want serving there. But you had leadership in both parties that put the national interest first, that put the institutional integrity of their own body first, that had a high level of what we call institutional patriotism. And you actually have probably a much higher average and median IQ in Congress now than we've had. You probably have, in general, higher ethical standards, many exceptions to that, but we have that. But you don't have that institutional patriotism, and you don't have a leadership across party lines that puts the institution first. The norms have been blown up, and that's a key part of the problem.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I mentioned the scientific endeavor. They have a common goal, which is the truth. And in the Congress, if the common goal is the institution's performance for the country, that's a common goal. If you don't have that goal, you have your parochial goal, then it breaks down.
Our mass media have been a part of the problem here as well. They treat their dialogue, this is especially true of cable news shows and of the Sunday shows, as if it's like a trial and the public watching is the jury. And you have the advocate for one side and the advocate for the other side, and then you make a judgment. But in fact, it often distorts that reality. And climate change, I think, is the best example. Where they've had discussions of climate change, they bring on a climate scientist and a climate denier. And the public looking at this thinks that the scientific community is evenly divided along those lines. And of course, it's 99% on one side and 1% on the other. And every scientific issue is not going to have everybody agreeing, even when the data and the facts are clear. But there is a consensus that develops. And if you end up presenting it as if that consensus just doesn't exist, or it's much more divided than it actually is, you give more traction to people who deny the facts.
It's a fundamental problem of how do you represent minority rights or minority views in such a way that puts them in perspective. But that's a challenge, as you said, even in the electoral process, where they're magnified. So my next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
I would say there wasn't a single book that did it. it was more my own personal experience. I came to Congress in 1969 and worked for a representative named Don Fraser of Minnesota, who ran the Democratic Study Group. And so I got immediately engaged in the reform process there. If there was a book at that time that influenced me, it was a book by Nelson Polsby, a late and very important political scientist, and actually more articles that Nelson wrote than the books that he did. But you know, because I had the privilege of being immersed in this process and then being engaged directly with members and the whole series of reform efforts, that had more of an impact on me than the books did.
The last question is just around your plans. What do you plan? What's coming for yourself in terms of your writing, in terms of your work?
Right now, my main effort is this continuity of government issue. You know, we do not have an insurance plan in place. We don't have a will for the political system. If United 93 had left on time instead of being 45 minutes late, it is very, very likely it would have hit the Capitol dome around the same time that the other plane hit the Pentagon. And we could have seen a Congress decapitated for months. A House that had to replenish itself by special elections that, even if you have just one, takes 3 or 4 months. If you had 200 or 300, it would be chaos. No Congress in the immediate aftermath of that attack would have meant the equivalent of martial law. Not a good way to run a political system. If the anthrax attack that followed had been a serious one done by terrorists, we could have had 60 senators in intensive care units with anthrax and no Senate. And you can't replace them. You'd have to expel them, and you'd need 2/3 to do that, and there wouldn't be members to do it. And you wouldn't have a quorum to do any official business. So we began to focus on how to deal with that. Now we have the additional problems. COVID could, or any other pandemic, could mean that hundreds of members of Congress couldn't get to Washington or couldn't function. How do we handle that? We have, it's true for presidential succession and the Supreme Court as well. And now, of course, we have these additional questions. You know, when you have the tribal divisions that we have right now, and you have a House where if 5 or 6 members of the Democratic Party were wiped out, you change the majority. You have to worry that somebody might target 5 or 6 members. It's not fanciful to think about that anymore. What January 6th showed us is that we have these internal problems. So we're now renewing these efforts. We had a commission that issued 3 reports, most of which were ignored by both parties in Congress. And now we're trying to supplement those with some additional recommendations. And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on that. And I'm also spending a lot of time on the filibuster rule in the Senate.
We'll have to touch on some of those questions in a future interview. Well, thanks so much, Norm, for joining me. Much appreciated.
Okay. You bet. My pleasure.